Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Postaje li Kina umorna od rata u Ukrajini? Otkako je ruska invazija Ukrajine ušla u treću godinu, Kina se bori nastaviti delikatno balansirati svoju poziciju. Stav strateške dvosmislenosti Pekinga da ne osuđuje rusku invaziju niti nudi otvorenu vojnu podršku sada je na testu zbog sve veće cijene rata i implikacija za globalne interese Kine. Na prvi pogled se čini da je Kina među onima koji su se najviše okoristili od ovog rata. Kupovina ruskih energenata po sniženim cijenama pružila je Kremlju ključni ekonomski pojas za spašavanje usred zapadnjačkih sankcija, ali istovremeno rat u Ukrajini je poremetio globalne lance snabdijevanja. Idemo sada do Washingtona gdje se nalazi Klaus Larres, profesor na Univerzitetu Sjevernoj Karolini u Chapel Hillu. Professor, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, I've been reading some of your work recently. Now, you have been dealing a lot with how the European Union and the US deal with China. And I wanted to ask you, the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has entered its third year. How would you describe China's position regarding the war in Ukraine? Would China like to see Russia get, in the Ukrainian quagmire, or would you want a quick end to the war in Ukraine?
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. It is, of course, difficult to know what the Chinese leaders think. China has been supporting Russia increasingly in the war in Ukraine. It is delivering non-military goods to Russia. It is so-called non-lethal weapons. It is purchasing ever-increasing amounts of oil and also gas from Russia at very cheap, discounted prices. And it's doing its best to support Russia. However, it has stopped short of delivering weapons, not least because the United States and above all the Europeans have warned China that that is a red line which should not be crossed, because then China and the Europeans and the United States would really fall out in a very severe way. Whether China would like Russia to see defeated, I wonder whether that one can say that. China certainly wants to prevent China and Russia's defeat. So they are propping up Russia. It is not in China's interest to see Russia defeated, but I don't think they want to make life more difficult for Russia. They are supporting Russia after all.
Right, but I've come across a number of mostly Western political analysts who have described at various times Russia and China as sort of allies. But if you look at things from a historical perspective, how has the relationship really been? I mean, following the end of the Cold War?
I wouldn't call Russia and China allies, and the two countries themselves are not talking about being allies or an alliance. There is a close partnership. There is support by China of Russia, but it is always and has always been an uneasy relationship. When you go back into history, particularly into Cold War history, then initially it was the Soviet Union which dominated its Chinese partner, and from the 1970s onwards, the United States used the falling out between Russia and China, which occurred from the early 1960s onwards, to drive a wedge between the two and came out as a laughing third. So the recognition of the United States of the PRC in 1979 was a clear way for the United States to divide the Russians and the Chinese and to benefit from that in its Cold War policies.
Mm-hmm. Now, Professor, I've been following China's activities in the Balkan region for quite some time now, and to a certain extent, this is somewhat a reflection of Chinese activities in Central Europe as a whole, and in Eastern Europe as a whole. And I was wondering, from your perspective, how would you describe China's relations with the European Union and with Europe as a whole? And is China interested in somewhat swaying the European Union away from its transatlantic relation with the United States?
Absolutely. This is a classic and traditional Chinese policy, which we have seen for the last few decades almost. In a way, you can say that China has given up on the United States. Of course, China tries to maintain as polite relations as possible, But I think the Chinese have concluded that a real alliance, a real partnership, a real cooperation with the United States will be impossible for the foreseeable future. And when you look at the action of the United States, you know, the export blocks on technological goods to China, on the tariffs imposed, on the very tense political and geopolitical relations regarding the South China Sea, and above all regarding Taiwan, cooperation between the United States and China seems to be impossible. The Chinese have not concluded that the Europeans are also a lost case. They believe the Europeans and China have something in common. They also mistakenly believe that the Europeans are dominated by the United States and would like to free themselves of the United States. This is, of course, a totally false misreading. The United States have actually been welcomed in Europe, and NATO is not a forced alliance. You know, via NATO, the United States doesn't impose itself on the Europeans, but China sees it like that, and they believe there is room to drive the Europeans away from the United States, not least because the trade relations, the economic relations between China and the EU and the 27 member states of the European Union are very intense. And that, of course, applies in particularly to big countries like Germany and also France, but also a number of other countries. And regarding Hungary and Serbia, for example, China has made quite big inroads, because both Hungary and Serbia are the outliers within the European Union and have particularly friendly relations with China, but also with Russia. So for the Chinese, from a Chinese point of view, they have actually succeeded in driving a wedge within the European Union, and perhaps have made a little bit of progress of drawing the European Union away from the United States. From a Western point of view, this reading is mistaken. The European Union has no intention to leave the United States and join China in some sort of close cooperation or close partnership.
Right. Bearing all this in mind, what you just said, how does Emmanuel Macron's talk about strategic autonomy of Europe, does it play into the hands of the Chinese?
From a Chinese point of view, they welcome that sort of talk, because they, of course, would like to see a more independent, a more strategically autonomous Europe. But what France meant, what was Macron meant, was, of course, the build-up of more military autonomy in Europe, but it didn't mean that he wanted to leave the partnership with the United States. You can have, of course, both. You can be closely allied with the United States via NATO, and you can still build up your own defense and security forces in Europe. That is not a contradiction in terms, but I think for the Chinese, it comes across as a contradiction, and they're hopeful that strategic autonomy means that the Europeans will cool towards the United States and perhaps will have warmer relations with China. And that is above all based on the very close economic relations, almost relations of dependence between Europe and some countries in Europe and China.
And Professor, does the Russia-Ukraine conflict have a spillover effect on Sino-US relations? Do both China and the US see the conflict as sort of a prism to view the future of Sino-US relations?
In a way, yes. China's support for Russia and increasing support for Russia has made relations with the United States, has made relations with the European Union even more difficult and more tense. I spoke at the beginning of a red line, which the Europeans and the Americans have told the Chinese if they send military aid to Russia. And I think they mean that seriously. So the war in Ukraine has, of course, influenced the whole security setup, the whole geopolitical setup in the entire world. But it also has really made relations with China even more difficult than they were already, clearly. And sometimes parallels are drawn between the conflict around Taiwan between the United States and China, and between between the Ukraine war and China. I don't know whether we can really do that. Clearly, Xi Jinping and the leaders in Beijing look at the war in Ukraine, look at the reaction of the Europeans and the United States regarding sanctions, regarding the delivery of military aid to Ukraine, and will draw their conclusions regarding Taiwan. Whether there is a direct link, we don't know for sure, but clearly China keeps that in mind.
Right. And finally, perhaps I should have asked you this somewhat earlier when we talked about EU-China relations, but if you were to trace back the origin of tensions between the European Union and China, what would it be exactly? And do you think that this mistrust that began earlier was somewhat reinforced after the invasion of Ukraine?
For decades, the Europeans and China have had very close relations, particularly economic and trade relations. The same applies to the United States. And by early in the new century, in the 21st century, many people in the West woke up to the fact that perhaps China is exploiting that relationship, is perhaps stealing intellectual properties, is subsidizing its goods unfairly. And I would put down a turning point round about the years 2015, 2016. In 2015, China published its industrial plan, China 2025, and that plan really was a shock to the system regarding the United States and the Europeans, because China seemed to have the ambition to take over technological leadership in the leading industries in the world, which so far had been dominated by the United States and Europe. And suddenly it seemed that China was a serious economic competitor, a strategic rival, as soon was said, and the relationship with China cooled a lot. And I think that turning point of the years 2015, 2016 then continued to escalate. And under the Trump administration, and Trump came into office in 2017, relations deteriorated even further.
Right, Professor, it was really a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk.
Thank you very much. You're most welcome.
Poštovani gledaoci, iz Vašingtona nam se uključio Klaus Larres, profesor na Univerzitetu u Sjevernoj Karolini u Chapel Hillu i saradnik u Woodrow Wilson centru. Prema podacima Štokholmskog instituta za istraživanje mira u 2023. godini, međunarodni vojni izdaci su porasli za gotovo 7%, dosegnuvši novu rekordnu vrijednost. Posebno visoki porasti zabilježeni su u Europi, Aziji i Bliskom istoku. To nas ne bi trebalo iznenaditi, s obzirom na brojne krize. Vodeće svjetske sile, poput SAD-a, Kine i Rusije, znatno povećavaju svoje vojne izdatke. Svijet je u modusu krize i po prvi put od 2009. godine kumulativni vojni izdaci u Africi, Bliskom istoku, Europi, Aziji, Okeaniji te u Sjevernoj i Južnoj Americi sveukupno se povećavaju. Najveći postotni porast za 2023. godinu nije u Ukrajini niti Rusiji, već u Demokratskoj Republici Kongo, gdje je došlo do povećanja od čak 105%. To je zemlja sa dugotrajnim sukobom između vladinih snaga i naoružanih pobunjeničkih grupa. Vojni izdaci Rusije kao postotak BDP-a dostigli su najvišu razinu od raspada Sovjetskog saveza i iznose 5,9%. Istovremeno, ti izdaci u Ukrajini dosegli su čak 37% BDP-a. Rat stvara veći teret za Ukrajinu nego za Rusiju jer je neravnopravan sukob. Međutim, Ukrajina je to uspjela prevazići zahvaljujući zapadnoj vojnoj podršci. Pogledajmo neke brojke. Kina je 2023. godine povećala vojne izdatke za 6% u poređenju sa 2022. godinom, što iznosi 296 milijardi dolara i što je polovina ukupnih izdataka za vojsku u regiji Azije i Okeanije. Kina dosljedno povećava svoje izdatke već 29 godina zaredom, što je najduži niz jedne pojedinačne zemlje. Kao odgovor na to, Japan i Tajvan su također povećali svoje izdatke svaki za 11% na 50,2, odnosno 16,6 milijardi dolara. U Južnom Sudanu, koji je zahvaćen unutrašnjim nasiljem i građanskim ratom, vojni izdaci su porasli za 78% u odnosu na prethodnu godinu. Poljska je zabilježila najveći porast vojnih izdataka u jednoj europskoj zemlji od 75% u odnosu na prethodnu godinu, dostižući 31,6 milijardi dolara. Vojni izdaci na Bliskom istoku porasli su za 9%, dostižući 200 milijardi dolara. Samo vojni izdaci Izraela, drugi po visini u regiji nakon Saudijske Arabije, porasli su za 24%, dostižući 27,5 milijardi dolara. Iran se sada nalazi na 4. mjestu na Bliskom istoku i Srednjoj Aziji sa 10,3 milijarde dolara. Detaljnije o ovoj temi pojašnjava nam Mark Katz, profesor na Univerzitetu George Mason. Professor Katz, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us now. Let's talk about Moscow's relations with the Gulf, and specifically with the United Arab Emirates. Now, the US and some other Western governments have been unhappy with how the UAE has been enabling Russia to evade sanctions by, continuing to buy Western goods and then reselling them to Moscow. Now, from your perspective, do you see at this point evidence that major Arab states, such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are running their own show when it comes to their foreign affairs and not exactly towing the line that DC wants them to follow?
Well, they are running their own show. They are not towing the line that Washington wants them to follow. They are pursuing what they see as their own interests. And I think that what they calculate, and I think correctly, is that Washington needs continued cooperation with them so much that although Washington may not like what they're doing, it has to put up with it.
Mm-hmm. Right, but some of these states have been U.S. allies for a very, very long time. How does that make Washington feel?
Well, obviously, Washington is unhappy, but I think for these states, I think what they feel is that they've been getting less commitment from the United States than they would like. There's been a lot of pressure on them, with regard to human rights, etc. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, that obviously everyone should observe human rights, but obviously the Russians and the Chinese aren't so concerned with these issues. I think there is also, the issues of Iranian-backed attacks, whether on Saudi oil facilities or on the UAE, and the lack of American response. So I think that that these countries feel that they're not so sure how much the U.S. is committed to them anymore, and maybe they need to improve their relations with Russia and China, and that maybe doing so will get America's attention. That even if the U.S. is less interested, so they think, in the Middle East, they know the U.S. is interested in Russia and China. Therefore, that's what gets America's attention.
Right. Now, Professor, how do Gulf states and Turkey view Russia, and from their perspective, does Russia still have a dimension to play as a key global actor in the world?
Well, I think that for these states, it's not a question of what they think Russia's role should be. It's what is Russia's role now. And I think it's also important to note that the Turkish view of Russia, I think, is a lot different from the Gulf Arab view. There's Turkey has had a very long and unpleasant history with Russia going back for centuries. Mm-hmm. And they know that, for Russia to win the war against Ukraine would not be good for Turkey. On the other hand, they also know that Russia's going to be there. And I think that they're concerned. In other words, I think that they're trying to maximize their own interests. They're acting as a regional power. For the Gulf Arabs, Russia is much, much farther away. They don't see what's going on in Ukraine as directly of interest to them, although obviously there are some things in which it is of interest, and obviously with regard to Black Sea grain exports, etc. But they're more concerned with their neighborhood, with Iran. And what they're concerned is that, increased Western attention to Ukraine means less Western attention to the Gulf.
Right, but I mean, Moscow's main partners in the Middle East have been, Iran and Syria, and these two countries have largely backed Putin's war effort. Now, by contrast, longtime allies and partners of the United States in the Middle East, such as Egypt, the Saudis, the Emiratis, Qatar, and Kuwait, have largely not really joined US and Western sanctions against Russia. And they have not really that openly supported Ukraine either, at least not with arms, and they haven't showered them with cash. Why has this occurred, and how do you make sense of it?
Yes, and I'd also point out that another American partner in the Middle East, Israel, has not joined in sanctions on Ukraine. So in other words, what's interesting is that each and every one of America's traditional Middle Eastern partners has not joined the U.S. in supporting Ukraine or sanctioning Russia. So this is simply, they don't see it as their conflict. They see, they want to keep on relatively good terms with Russia, partly to profit from doing so, but also I think that what they're fearful of is that to the extent that they comply with the U.S. on Ukraine, Russia could do things to them that are fairly nasty in terms of
through Iran.
Yes, through Iran in particular. In other words, I think that for America's Middle Eastern partners, they see Russia as somehow serving to restrain Iran. Now, whether this is actually true or not, I think remains to be seen. We'll see with regard to, obviously the Russians are increasingly dependent on Iran for drones and other weapons, it appears. And I think everyone wants to know, what is Iran going to demand in return? And I think what's fascinating is that so far, the Iranians haven't really gotten an awful lot from Russia in return. The Russians are doing things that the Iranians don't like, including continuing their good relationships with the Arab Gulf states. So I think that, but who knows whether that's going to change. So I think from the Arab Gulf point of view, that they see their policy as paying off, that Russia could help Iran more despite its, because of its increased dependence on Iran. But so far, that really hasn't happened.
Now, you mentioned Israel briefly. Let's talk about Israel. So during the initial phase of Israel's war against Gaza, Russia adopted a cautious stance, condemning the attack on civilians and calling for a comprehensive political solution. However, afterwards, Moscow's position somewhat changed and became, tougher in a way by, condemning Israeli attacks. Now, what kind of a relationship does Russia want to have with Israel?
Well, it's a very complicated relationship. Obviously, before Putin, the Moscow's relation with Israel was not good at all. What's interesting is that under Putin, Russian relations with Israel have improved markedly. A lot of trade, a lot of security cooperation, huge Russian diaspora, speaking diaspora in Israel. Lots of Russian tourists go there. Right. And the Putin-Netanyahu relationship has, in the past, been pretty close. So I think that, and for the Israelis, what they see is, they describe Russia as their neighbor in Syria, and Russia plays an important role. There's this deconfliction agreement between Russia and Israel, whereby the Russians turn a blind eye to Israeli attacks on Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria. The Israelis very much want that to continue. They don't want Russia doing anything to prevent them from launching such attacks. And it really is interesting. I think for the Iranian government, it must be pretty shocking. As much as Iran does to help Russia, Russia's doing nothing to help the Iranians in Syria vis-a-vis Israel. And I think that this Israeli attack on the Iranian diplomatic facility in Syria, this is something that probably the Russians, were observing. In other words, they could have done something to at least warn the Iranians, possibly, but they didn't. In other words, I think from Iran's point of view, the partnership between Russia and Israel is all too close.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And speaking of relations between Israel and Russia, I mean, how do you make sense of the fact that a major world power, at least at one in decline, such as Russia, which has been boasting about having, fifth generation fighter jets and very advanced missiles and weaponry, is now relying on very cheap Iranian and North Korean drones and missiles in its war against Ukraine?
Well, yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head. That Russia, obviously, if one has to rely on Iran and North Korea for arms supplies, that shows just how desperate the Russians are, and that their own domestic stocks must be quite limited. So yeah, It does show that they're not in that strong a position. On the other hand, I think from Iran's point of view, why isn't Russia doing more for them in return? And that isn't it. And will that change at some point?
Mm-hmm. Right, Professor. It was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so very much.
Ekonomski faktori opterećuju položaj Kine. Iako je profitirao od jeftinih ruskih energenata, Peking je doživio poremećaje u svojim globalnim trgovačkim interesima zbog sankcija, šokova u dobavljačkim lancima, prijetnji pomorskim rutama i nestabilnosti na ključnim tržištima. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našem web portalu balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.